Number 1.
When a teenager runs away from home, law enforcement often looks to the teen's prior behavior to determine how thorough a search will be conducted at the time the teen goes missing. Teenagers who have previously run away or had encounters with law enforcement are often not looked for as carefully as a well-behaved teen who goes missing. But the truth is that when a teenager who has a history of bad decision-making disappears, that teenager is in as much need of being found as a teenager without that history. Both are at risk of putting themselves in greater danger. The fact that many teens think they are capable of handling difficult and dangerous situations doesn't mean that they are. In the early 80s, Bill Cordes was not having the easiest of times navigating late childhood and his early teenage years. When he disappeared at the end of March 1984, he had been living at Oak Ridge Group Home in Auburn, California, for 3 months. Due to his behavior, he had reached some kind of a tipping point, and after stealing beer from a store, he was placed in a group home and made a ward of the court. But it also wasn't Bill's first time in a group home. Always a challenging child despite having an intact family, Bill had been placed in several foster homes from the time he was 10 until he was 12. His mother describes him as a child who often had extensive tantrums, was unable to take no for an answer, and needed a good deal of structure. His behavior also seemed to run in streaks, and like the little girl Henry Wadsworth immortalized in rhyme. When he was good, he was very good indeed, and when he was bad, he was horrid. In hindsight, the offense that triggered the cascade of consequences that would befall the then 15-year-old does not seem so terrible. He stole $8 worth of beer, but the consequences of this punishment have reverberated for decades. Born in San Francisco County, California, on July 11, 1968, William Charles Cordes joined his parents, Charles and Margaret Cordes, and a slightly older sister, Julia, on his mother's birthday. The family would continue to grow with a set of twins, Charles and Francis, born 3 years later, and a fifth and final child, Kevin, born 4 years later. Eventually, the family would leave the Bay Area of California and head east along U.S. Route 50 to the town of Placerville, and Bill would end up living in a group home in Auburn, California, 1 county over and 30 miles north of his family in Placerville. And it was just a little over 4 miles from the group home where he was living that Bill would have a rendezvous with fate that has left his family both perplexed and in mourning over his disappearance. On March 30, 2004, 2 decades to the day since he had last been seen, the family and friends of William Bill Cordes gathered in front of the single-family residence that in 1984 was a group home for teen boys who were experiencing difficulty as they made the transition from adolescence to adulthood. They were there to remember the son, brother, cousin, and friend who had, to the best of their knowledge, been left on the side of the road to stay with a car that had sputtered to a stop on the side of I-80 near the Dry Creek Road exit. But in the time it took his friends to go get some gas and return to the car, Bill Cordes had vanished. It was the last place that Bill Cordes had called home before he sneaked off in the night with 2 of his group home compatriots to catch a ride to a party with another friend who was 18 and had a car. It is also the place that his family and friends decided to meet on the 20th anniversary of his disappearance, in an effort to celebrate the life they believe was cut short, and to generate any leads that might lead to finding him. Any criminal record Bill might have had before he stole $8 of beer from a store is not publicly available, but the facts that give some insight in that are on the record are as follows. Bill had lived in multiple group homes. He had been made a ward of the court. Despite his lengthy history of difficult behavior, he always called when he was going to be out all night. It seems that both Bill's family and the criminal justice system were doing what they could to help him right his life and move forward toward adulthood, but as a result of Bill's last group home placement, the trajectory of his life took a turn neither the courts nor his family anticipated. The Oak Ridge Group Home was located in a residential neighborhood near 2 major roads that run through Auburn, California, as well as Interstate 80, which runs the width of North America, from San Francisco, California, to Teaneck, New Jersey. Heading east from Auburn, the first major city is Reno, Nevada. Bill had moved to the new group home when the one he had been living in, previously located in Garden Valley, closed. He had only been at Oak Ridge for about 3 months, when he slipped out into the night with 2 friends who had found an 18-year-old, who apparently didn't know any better than to give them a ride. According to a former girlfriend, Bill had broken up with her earlier that evening, and whether the breakup contributed to his disappearance was something he thought he needed to do before he left, or was just a sad coincidence, has not been determined. According to the story that was told in the aftermath of Bill Cordez's disappearance, the 3 group home compatriots and their friend with a car had gone to a party at a location that law enforcement has never been identified. They drank beer until 5 or 6 in the morning, and on their way back to Oak Ridge, they ran out of gas on Interstate 80. The driver and Bill's 2 group home friends left, and when they returned, Bill was gone. There hasn't been a verified sighting of him since that day. There were several problems with the investigation into the initial disappearance of William Bill Cordez, not the least of which was that the Placer County Sheriff's Department did not begin looking into it until almost a year had passed. While Charles and Margaret Cordez filed a missing persons report in early April of 1984, it was thrown out, and it wasn't until early March of 1985 that the Placer County Sheriff's Department began to look for their missing son. By then the trail had run pretty cold. Still, articles ran in both the Auburn Journal and the Mountain Democrat, with a photo of Bill at the age of 15, and detailing what was known of the circumstances of his disappearance. The sheriff's department said there was a policy that prevented them from questioning the young men who were with Bill the morning he is believed to have disappeared. But later, the sheriff's department said they did talk to them. Bill's sister and one of his brothers took it up on themselves to track down those same young men who had spent that last evening with their brother, and drove to the Bay Area to meet them. Over a meal of pizza, the siblings asked questions that neither of Bill's former housemates were able to answer. They had no specific memory of the evening that they were able to share. It could be that the young men were lying. It could be that on that evening in question they drank too much to be able to remember anything. It could be that too much time had passed for them to remember it clearly, or it could be that the evening was so ordinary that even in retrospect, when it became apparent that something had happened to Bill, there was nothing to remember. Marge Cordez, Bill's mother, tracked down both the young man who gave her son a ride, as well as the young woman who hosted the party, but they were not able to add any details that could help her find her son. The decision by law enforcement not to look for Bill Cordez until he had been gone for almost a year meant that here was no car to be processed, no inventory to take of things Bill left behind, and the opportunity to contemporaneously question the people who were with Bill that night was lost forever. It is not unreasonable to surmise that Bill could have taken the opportunity to hitchhike to Reno, Nevada, and in on report his group home housemates seemed to think that was where he would have gone. Bill had spent time in a group home in Half Moon Bay, California, where he learned to ride horses, and so it is not inconceivable that he might have thought he could try hand at a ranching sort of life. Or perhaps he followed Interstate 80 to the very end and made his way to Teaneck, New Jersey. There were many alleged sightings of him on the East Coast, and maybe he did make it that far. Or maybe he met up with foul play, or an accident and his body has yet to be discovered or identified, a possibility the family now considers the most likely, as they don't believe he would leave them to wonder what had become of him. Margaret Cordez is open and honest about the challenges of raising Bill, but those challenges don't make his disappearance and subsequent absence any easier. Like many persons long missing from a time before cell phones and the internet, Bill Cordez has a NamUs file number, an NCMEC file number, and a profile at Charlie Project. At the time of his disappearance, Bill Cordez was 15 years old and a few months shy of his 16th birthday. He was 5'6", weighed 135 pounds, and had brown hair and hazel eyes. When someone goes missing, and no sign of them is ever found, there is a hole in the family that cannot be repaired. Unlike a death, when a person goes missing, so do the usual human rituals. There are no last goodbyes, no graduations, no weddings, no funeral, no obituary. There is just limbo and unknowing.
Number 2.
It was bitterly cold when 11-year-old Jon Dabkowski got home from school on Thursday, January 14, 1982. Jon and his 5-year-old sister, Melanie, lived with their mother, Janine, in a modest home in the small town of Tarentum, Pa. The past couple of years had been rough for Janine. Melanie had been hit by a car 2 years earlier, and she had been in a coma for a month. Janine and her husband hadn't had a great marriage before the accident, and things got worse while Melanie was in the hospital. Their daughter would eventually make a full recovery. Their marriage would not. Janine remained in the house and had custody of both children. Recently, she had started dating again. Her boyfriend, Bob Richards, was at the house that afternoon. Bob was a Tarentum police officer, and Jon got along well with him. Jon, who was a Boy Scout, enjoyed playing football and baseball, but perhaps his favorite pastime was teasing his younger sister. That afternoon, he was chasing her around the house with Bob's handcuffs. Jon and his family had just finished eating dinner when there was a knock at the door. It was Jon's best friend, Gabriel Menarson. Gabe and his family had just moved to the neighborhood 5 months before. Gabe was a year younger than Jon, but as is often the case with children who are far too young to drive, geography was more important than age. Gabe's house was only a couple of doors down from Jon's, and the two had quickly become best friends. They went to Jon's bedroom and listened to music on his stereo for a while. Around 5:30 p.m., Gabe said he needed to go home for supper, and he invited Jon to come with him. Though the walk was short, under a minute, it was extremely cold outside, so the boys bundled up in heavy coats and hats before leaving. Janine reminded Jon that it was a school night, so he needed to be home by 8 p.m. Bob jokingly reminded them that he would be on patrol that night and he didn't want to catch the boys throwing snowballs at cars. They laughed and walked out the front door. Gabe lived with his parents and 2 younger brothers, and his mother was pregnant at the time. They were renting the home, and when they first expressed interest in it, the landlord had been reluctant to rent it to them. The Allegheny River was only yards away from the house, and the landlord wasn't sure it would be safe enough for a family with small children. Larry and Margaret Menarson promised that their children wouldn't be allowed to go near the river, and the landlord eventually gave in. They repeatedly warned their sons that the river was completely off limits. Jon's mother also had strict rules about the river. Jon was well aware of the dangers associated with the water, especially in winter. A year earlier, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette had printed a picture of people walking on top of the frozen river, and Jon had pointed it out to his mother in disbelief. He knew how unsafe the river could be, and he couldn't understand why anyone would risk trying to walk on it. After Bob had left for work, Janine's dad called. Since Melanie was the only child home, the house was quiet, and Janine lost track of time as she and her father chatted. Suddenly, she realized it was 8:30 p.m. and Jon hadn't returned home. He was usually quite responsible, and would always call her if he was running late for any reason. Janine quickly said goodbye to her father and hung up the phone. She assumed Jon had tried to call while she had been talking to her dad. There was no call waiting or voicemail in 1982. If Jon had been trying to call, he would have gotten a busy signal and had no way of leaving a message. She waited a few minutes, but when she didn't hear from Jon, she called Gabe's house and spoke with Larry. He told her that they boys had never shown up at the house that evening. Gabe's parents had figured that he had decided to stay at Jon's instead of coming home for dinner. At first, Janine was annoyed. Jon knew he had an 8 p.m. curfew on school nights, and he hadn't mentioned that the boys would be going anywhere other than Gabe's house. She called a local roller skating rink where the boys liked to hang out, and the employee who answered the phone told her that the boys had just left. She waited until 9 p.m., but there was still no sign of Jon, so she called the skating rink back. Once again, she was told that the boys had just left. By 9:30 p.m., she was still angry, but was also starting to get a little worried. She decided to drive to the roller skating rink. If the boys really had just left, maybe she would pass them on the drive over. When she got there, there was no sign of the boys. After questioning some of the kids there, she realized that Jon and Gabe had never gone there that evening. Apparently, the employee who answered the phone would always tell parents who called that their child had just left. It was easier than actually trying to determine if the person was there or not. Unsure what was going on and trying not to panic, Janine went back home and called the police. Police began going from door to door in the neighborhood, trying to find anyone who might have seen the two boys after they left Jon's house. Most of them hadn't. It was a cold night and few people had ventured outside. But one neighbor said that, when she was driving back from the beauty parlor around 5:45 p.m., she had seen two small boys playing near the river. Bloodhounds were brought in to see if they could determine the path that the boys had taken. The dogs led their handlers to a vacant houseboat that was moored on the river near Riverview Park. Police determined that there were footprints leading to the river, but couldn't find any leading away from the river. Along the riverbank, the ice was thick enough to hold a person's weight, but it got thinner towards the middle of the river. Investigators found a hole in the ice that was approximately 10 feet from where the houseboat was moored and 30 feet away from the riverbank. Based on this evidence, the police were convinced that they boys had fallen through the ice and drowned. Although they were almost certain that the boys were going to be found in the river, police conducted a search of the entire town just in case. Over 100 police officers, firefighters, and civilian volunteers fanned out across Tarentum. They knew that, if the boys had somehow become lost outside, their chances of survival were extremely slim. No one would be able to last long in the bitter temperatures and biting wind. It was only 12 degrees outside, and the strong wind made it feel even colder than that. Numerous searches of the river were made over the course of the next 10 days. A team of 35 divers from the U.S. Army Corps were called in to help the state police divers, and volunteer divers also showed up to offer their assistance. Some of the officers felt that the boys would have been carried away by the current of the river. Others believed that the boys would have been dragged under the water by their heavy clothing, and may have become snagged along the bottom of the river, which was around 18 feet deep. None of the divers, however, were able to find any evidence of the boys in the water. The water was far too cold for the divers to stay in it for any length of time, as temperatures reached a record-breaking 18 degrees below zero. Not even certified ice divers could work in such extreme cold, as their breathing apparatus would freeze up within 30 minutes. Finally, with no sign of the boys, and no absolute proof they were in the water, the search of the river was called off. The police were unwilling to risk the safety of the divers, especially when they weren't 100% sure that Jon and Gabe had ended up in the water. The search wasn't being completely discontinued. A police helicopter would continue to do regular checks of the river from the air, and barge companies operating in the area were asked to keep an eye out for anything unusual in the river. If they reported seeing anything, divers could be sent back into the water to check it out. Jon and Gabe's parents had mixed emotions when the searches of the river bottom were called off. On the one hand, they hadn't wanted the divers to find anything. They wanted to believe that their sons were still alive, but the pain of not knowing if they were alive or dead was heart-wrenching. They desperately wanted answers, but unlike the police, they were not convinced that the boys had ended up in the river. They pointed out the fact that an extensive search of the river had failed to yield any evidence of the two boys. Unless police could show them something belonging to either boy, they were not prepared to admit that their sons had drowned. The boys had been wearing jackets, boots, and hats. Surely something would surface if the boys were in the water. Jon and Gabe both knew they were not supposed to go near the river, and they had never done so in the past. Neither mother could believe that they would have picked such a bitter cold day to defy the rule for the first time. The witness who had seen two boys playing near the river was unable to identify Jon and Gabe as the children she had seen. Even if it had been the two boys, she only saw them near the river. There were no witnesses who had seen them attempting to walk on the frozen water. Gabe's house was located a mere 10 feet from the riverbank. Anyone driving by would have had difficulty discerning whether the boys were playing at the river or were simply in Gabe's yard. Both mothers were angry about the fact that the FBI wouldn't get involved in the case. At the time, FBI police prevented the agency getting involved in missing children cases. Unless there was proof that an abduction had taken place, there was a demand for a ransom, or there was evidence that the child had been transported across state lines. None of these circumstances were present in this case. The FBI sent pictures of the boys to be entered into the NCIC database, but that was the extent of their involvement. Echoing the words of John Walsh, both mothers decried this policy, claiming that children were given second-class status by the FBI. The agency would help track down stolen cars and money, but not missing children. By February 11th, the boys had been missing for almost a month. Larry and Margaret Minarson wrote a letter to the editor of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, saying that they were heartsick over what they perceived to be complete apathy on the part of local police who were investigating the case. They felt that the police had been far too quick to write off the boys as drowning victims, despite no evidence proving they had fallen into the river. While they were thankful for all the volunteers who had assisted in the search of the river, they felt that the police should be investigating other possibilities, as the river search had been fruitless. In their opinion, the police were no longer doing anything to find the boys. Instead, they had adopted a wait-and-see attitude, assuming the bodies of the boys would eventually show up in some part of the river. Gabe's parents believed that the fact that the boys did not come from wealthy families had a lot to do with why the police didn't seem to care if they found them or not. Bob Richards was in the unenviable position of being both close to one of the missing boys. He and Janine would soon end up getting married, making him Jon's stepfather and being a police officer. He could understand why police took the approach they did in investigating the boys' disappearance. He had seen the tracks leading down to the river, and admitted that he could not see any tracks leading away from it. The logical conclusion was that the boys had somehow ended up falling through the ice. But Bob also knew Jon fairly well, and he couldn't believe that the boy would have been anywhere near the river that day. That fact alone made him believe it could be possible that something else had happened to the boys. But he bristled at the suggestion of Gabe's parents that the police didn't care about the boys because they weren't wealthy. He knew firsthand just how much the officers did care, regardless of the financial status of the families. As months passed without any sign of the boys or any of their belongings, detectives were realistic about the fact that they would most likely never be found alive. The police chief told reporters that he would love to get a phone call from someone saying the boys had been found, but he didn't believe it would happen. There was no evidence leading police to believe that an abduction had taken place, and no one believed that the two boys would have run away. The boys were not troublemakers, and neither of them had any problems in their personal lives that would have made them want to run away. Detectives were certain that the boys were dead, but they had no conclusive evidence supporting this theory. Because of that, the boys would remain categorized as missing children in the national database. Occasionally, police received tips that the boys had been spotted somewhere, and they investigated every lead that came in. In September of 1986, a caller from Spokane, Washington, told police that Gabe was living in that city and was enrolled in school under the first name Kevin. Another person called from Rock Springs, Wyoming, and said that Gabe was seen there using the name Kenny Schramm. In each case, investigators were dispatched to look into the claims, but the leads went nowhere. On July 9, 1998, a Virginia state trooper named Philip Stinson pulled over a car that was speeding down Interstate 77. The trooper asked for the man's license and registration, and the driver handed them over. His license identified him as Jon Michael Dabkowski and listed his address as being in Ladson, South Carolina. The name on the car registration was the same. Although the man was cooperative with the trooper, it was 3 a.m. and the trooper didn't get a very good vibe from the man. He ran the man's license through the NCIC, and sure enough, the computer came back with a hit. But it wasn't for an outstanding warrant like the trooper expected. Instead, he learned that the license holder was listed as a missing person from Pennsylvania. It was a claim that the driver denied, telling the trooper that the missing person case had been resolved years earlier. The trooper was stunned, but there wasn't much he could do at that moment. Though only a child, when he was reported missing, the man was now an adult, and no crime had been committed. This meant that the trooper wasn't legally allowed to detain the man while he tried to reach his parents in Pennsylvania. He gave the driver a speeding ticket and let him go. The trooper immediately went back to the police station and placed a call to authorities in Paw. For a couple of brief hours, Janine was elated. The spark of hope she'd held on to for 16 years ignited. She and Bob Richards, now husband and wife, as well as John's father, were ready to drive to Ladson, South Carolina. But before they could leave, authorities in Virginia called back. The man wasn't Jon Dabkowski at all. A man named Neil Hammonds, who had a warrant out for his arrest in South Carolina, had discovered John's picture on a missing children website and decided to assume his identity. John's parents, as well as law enforcement, were stunned at how easily Neil had been able to assume John's identity. He had simply mailed away for a copy of his birth certificate, and then used that to get a copy of John's social security card and a driver's license. Any time a birth certificate was requested, there was a check done to assure that the person was not listed as being deceased. Since Jon was still listed as a missing person, the request for his birth certificate had not been flagged. By law, a copy of a birth certificate is only supposed to be released to the person whose name appears on it. The ease with which Neil was able to obtain John's prompted an examination of the system, and safeguards would eventually be put into place to minimize the chance that something like this could happen again. The Neil Hammonds fiasco brought the case of the missing boys back into the headlines for a while, but it soon faded back into obscurity. Both families have moved on, out of necessity, but will never forget about Jon and Gabe. As months passed without any sign of the boys or any of their belongings, detectives were realistic about the fact that they would most likely never be found alive. The police chief told reporters that he would love to get a phone call from someone saying the boys had been found, but he didn't believe it would happen. There was no evidence leading police to believe that an abduction had taken place, and no one believed that the two boys would have run away. The boys were not troublemakers, and neither of them had any problems in their personal lives that would have made them want to run away. Detectives were certain that the boys were dead, but they had no conclusive evidence supporting this theory. Because of that, the boys would remain categorized as missing children in the national database. Occasionally, police received tips that the boys had been spotted somewhere, and they investigated every lead that came in. In September of 1986, a caller from Spokane, Washington, told police that Gabe was living in that city and was enrolled in school under the first name Kevin. Another person called from Rock Springs, Wyoming, and said that Gabe was seen there using the name Kenny Schramm. In each case, investigators were dispatched to look into the claims, but the leads went nowhere. On July 9, 1998, a Virginia state trooper named Philip Stinson pulled over a car that was speeding down Interstate 77. The trooper asked for the man's license and registration, and the driver handed them over. His license identified him as Jon Michael Dabkowski and listed his address as being in Ladson, South Carolina. The name on the car registration was the same. Although the man was cooperative with the trooper, it was 3 a.m. and the trooper didn't get a very good vibe from the man. He ran the man's license through the NCIC, and sure enough, the computer came back with a hit. But it wasn't for an outstanding warrant like the trooper expected. Instead, he learned that the license holder was listed as a missing person from Pennsylvania. It was a claim that the driver denied, telling the trooper that the missing person case had been resolved years earlier. The trooper was stunned, but there wasn't much he could do at that moment. Though only a child, when he was reported missing, the man was now an adult, and no crime had been committed. This meant that the trooper wasn't legally allowed to detain the man while he tried to reach his parents in Pennsylvania. He gave the driver a speeding ticket and let him go. The trooper immediately went back to the police station and placed a call to authorities in Paw. For a couple of brief hours, Janine was elated. The spark of hope she'd held on to for 16 years ignited. She and Bob Richards, now husband and wife, as well as John's father, were ready to drive to Ladson, South Carolina. But before they could leave, authorities in Virginia called back. The man wasn't Jon Dabkowski at all. A man named Neil Hammonds, who had a warrant out for his arrest in South Carolina, had discovered John's picture on a missing children website and decided to assume his identity. John's parents, as well as law enforcement, were stunned at how easily Neil had been able to assume John's identity. He had simply mailed away for a copy of his birth certificate, and then used that to get a copy of John's social security card and a driver's license. Any time a birth certificate was requested, there was a check done to assure that the person was not listed as being deceased. Since Jon was still listed as a missing person, the request for his birth certificate had not been flagged. By law, a copy of a birth certificate is only supposed to be released to the person whose name appears on it. The ease with which Neil was able to obtain John's prompted an examination of the system, and safeguards would eventually be put into place to minimize the chance that something like this could happen again. The Neil Hammonds fiasco brought the case of the missing boys back into the headlines for a while, but it soon faded back into obscurity. Both families have moved on, out of necessity, but will never forget about Jon and Gabe.
Number 3.
Anyone who ever met Anthonette Cayedito could tell she was a very special girl. Affectionately nicknamed Squirrel by friends and family, she was described as a kind and gentle spirit, a lover of music, especially Michael Jackson, The Color Purple, and her Bible studies, dedicated in school and wise beyond her years, and exceedingly maternal. At only 6 years old, she was helping her single mother, Penny, raise her 2 little sisters, Wendy and Sadie. She cooked their meals, did their laundry, and occasionally babysat them. Everyone believed she had a bright future ahead of her. Unfortunately for the young girl, she would never get to see it. On the evening of April 6, 1986, Penny Cayedito left her 3 daughters at their Gallup, New Mexico home in the care of a babysitter, and went out with some friends. She returned home a few hours later, around midnight, and dismissed the babysitter, briefly checking on the girls before heading off to bed herself. She woke at 7 the next morning to take her daughters to Bible school. She was met with a horrifying shock when she went to rouse them. Wendy and Sadie were in their beds, but Anthonette was gone. She was only 9 years old. Penny immediately reported her daughter's disappearance to the police, and an investigation was launched. Police learned from Wendy that, at approximately 3 in the morning, she and her sister heard a knock at the door. Anthonette went to answer the door but never came back to bed. Wendy believed that whoever was at the door was their uncle, having heard a man identify himself as Uncle Joe. Perhaps this is why she wasn't concerned when Anthonette didn't return. Police questioned the girl's uncle to see if he had any involvement in Anthonette's disappearance, but he was quickly ruled out. Whoever had taken the girl from her home wasn't a kindly relative, and likely didn't have good intentions. Police tirelessly searched for the girl, but turned up no leads. Anthonette had vanished without a trace. And then they received their first real clue. A little over a year following Anthonette's disappearance, Gallup police officers received a 911 call from a young girl, claiming to be the missing Anthonette Cayedito. She told the 911 operators that she was being held against her will in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Chillingly, before the girl could give any more information, a male voice could be heard shouting in the background, "Who said you could use the phone?" And the line went dead. Since this call occurred in a time before 911 operators could trace callers' locations, it was never confirmed if Anthonette was actually in Albuquerque, or if the caller was even Anthonette. Indeed, the call could have been nothing more than a cruel prank. Another 4 years would pass before there would be another break in the case when in 1990, a waitress at a diner in Carson City, Nevada, claimed to have seen the girl, now 14 years old, sitting at a table with a man and a woman. She described the couple as dirty, and the girl as nervous, continuously dropping her fork. Every time the waitress stooped to pick up the fork, the girl grabbed her hand and squeezed it. Once the trio had left the diner, the waitress noticed that the girl had left a note behind on a napkin. It read, "Please help me. Call the police." Unfortunately, just like the phone call, this lead went nowhere, and whether or not the nervous girl was Anthonette remains to be seen. There are very few theories in this case. The only significant one the police had was Anthonette's uncle, Penny's brother-in-law, but as stated earlier, he was cleared very quickly and never named a suspect. Other than that, police have no theories, and it seems Anthonette was kidnapped by a stranger who disappeared with her in the wind. 3 years after her disappearance, Anthonette's aunt, Lauja, also vanished, never to be seen again. It's been posited that her disappearance is somehow connected to Anthonette's, but nothing concrete has ever come up that ties the two together. Wendy, the only witness to Anthonette's kidnapping, suffered greatly upon losing her big sister. In her teen and young adult years, she turned to drugs, alcohol, and crime as a way to avoid thinking about her trauma. After many years of spiraling, she was finally able to turn her life around in 2007, and now lives in Bakersfield, California with her family, and enjoys a thriving career. This is how she honors Anthonette's life. Little is currently known about Sadie, Anthonette's other sister, and it's believed that she and Wendy have become estranged from each other as a result of Anthonette's disappearance and Wendy's less than healthy coping mechanisms. Penny Cayedito died in 1999, never learning what happened to her daughter. Police believe Anthonette is likely deceased, but without any further evidence or a body, they are unable to claim anything conclusively. For now, she is still listed as a missing person, and her case remains open.
Number 4.
Paul Baker was last seen in Beaufort, South Carolina on March 5, 1987. His stepmother, Susan Baker, stated she put the child down for a nap at approximately 11 a.m. and fell asleep herself under the influence of alcohol and muscle relaxants. She claimed that she woke up between 12:30 p.m. and 1:30 p.m. to a call from Paul's father, James Baker. He stated that station's family services notified him that a woman called them and claimed she had Paul and that he was okay. Paul was discovered missing after that and was never seen again afterwards. Paul's parents had divorced in the mid-1980s after James had an affair with Susan, whom was Paul and his older sister, Nina's babysitter at the time. Paul's mother, Linda Solorzano, stated she moved out of the home with Paul and Nina shortly after the divorce occurred. However, Linda has limited financial means after the separation, and James never paid child support after the divorce. She applied for public assistance. The judge that finalized the divorce sided with James and stated that Linda did not have the means to support her children and she lost custody of both children. James was given full custody of both his children and married Susan afterwards. They purchased the home in South Carolina and settled there. James was a sergeant at the Marine Corps Air Station at the time, and Susan cares for both children regularly. After Paul's disappearance, James accused Linda of making the phone call and taking Paul. It was determined, however, that she was not even in the state at the time of Paul's disappearance and had nothing to do with it. In the days after Paul's disappearance, Susan and James were subjected to polygraph exams. Susan's results were ruled inconclusive, and James failed his. Susan did admit she did not like the task of caring for Nina of Paul, and no longer wished to do it. She said she wanted to send the children back with Linda. She stated she was stressed by the entire responsibility. James initially told investigators that Susan harshly punished both Paul and Nina. He once suggested that Susan had killed Paul and disposed of his body in the Battery Creek. He also stated that Nina might be in danger from her. The next day, he recanted his theory and said he did not believe Susan to be responsible for whatever happened to the child. On March 24th, the Baker residence was searched, and authorities uncovered what appeared to be blood spatters which were sent away for analysis. It's unknown as to what happened to them. State authorities removed Nina from the Baker residence on March 23, 1987, after Paul's statements about Susan came to light. Investigators soon learned that Nina suffered untreated broken bones and had ulcerated sores located on her back. Nina stated that Susan beat her with a stick and made her stay in a closet for very long periods of time. She stated that Susan also abused Paul. She would whip him in response to his wetting of his bed. She would also make him stand in a corner for more than a few hours. James did say that Paul was ill in the days prior to his disappearance. In addition to that, he soiled his pants and his bed. On the day of his disappearance, Nina said she couldn't recall seeing Paul or hearing his voice at all that day. She came home from school at 11 a.m. and Susan told her that Paul had felt better and was playing outside in the backyard. Shortly afterwards, she could hear Susan yelling for Paul to come and take his nap. Nina fell asleep, and when she awoke, Susan told her Paul was missing. Susan was charged with assault and battery with intent to kill in connection to the abuse brought upon Nina. She was convicted on a lesser charge of assault and battery of a high and aggravated nature. She was originally sentenced to 10 years in prison, but only served 80 days when her sentence was suspended. She completed a 5-year term of probation. In the years after Paul's disappearance and Nina's removal from James' custody, Linda fought to have her daughter back in her custody. She was in a legal battle for years. Nina spent time in foster care and was eventually placed with her maternal grandmother. During this time, Linda was given the opportunity to improve her life. Nina went to live with Linda in 1992. She hadn't seen her father since she was removed from his custody in 1987, and only saw him again in 2000. She remains estranged from him, and has since married, become a nurse, and has 3 children of her own. In 1999, James was discharged from military service after authorities reopened the investigation into Paul's disappearance. A former cellmate of Susan came forward and stated that Susan told her the truth about what happened to Paul. Susan allegedly told her that Paul was killed by James after he severely beat the child, and that Paul's body was buried in a neighbor's yard. The statement was never verified. Susan and James were both extradited from their residence in Florida in 2000 and taken back to South Carolina in connection to Paul's disappearance. After Paul's disappearance was reopened, both Bakers were charged with assault and battery of a high and aggravated nature. A grand jury refused to indict either of them, but Susan was indicted for child neglect. They decided not to go forward with the charge and Paul's case went cold once again. In 2009, Susan was arrested along with the mother of Shannon Lee Dedrick, who disappeared from her home in Chipley, Florida in November of 2009. Susan was the child babysitter and half-sister to Shannon's father, James Russell Dedrick Jr. 5 days after Shannon's disappearance, she was found alive and in good health. She was concealed in a cedar chest under a bed in Susan's home located in the 3300 block of Orange Hill Road in Chipley. She was in the chest for approximately a day and a half. Susan and Shannon's mother, Cynthia Lynn Mercer, were both charged with several felonies and misdemeanors which included child neglect, custodial interference, child desertion, filing a false report and contribution to the delinquency of a child. Susan claimed that Mercer willingly gave the child to her. James was arrested shortly after Shannon was found, but has been released without charge. He stated he was unaware of the kidnapping and had no idea his own child was hidden in his own home. 2 months prior to Shannon's disappearance, Susan wrote to the Florida governor saying that both Cynthia and James were drug users and feared for the child's well-being. Child Protective Services investigated both of Shannon's parents, who were entered into assistance and treatment programs afterwards. The child remained in their custody. At her trial, Susan claimed she had only taken the baby to protect her from her parents. Shannon was removed from her parents' custody and now lives out of state. Both parents have lost the possibility of having contact with her. Susan was convicted of 3 felony charges in October of 2010 and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Shannon's mother's role in her daughter's disappearance cannot be proven. After the news of the kidnapping incident came to light, Paul's disappearance received some publicity, but nothing has been found in his case to indicate his whereabouts or his fate. Paul's disappearance remains unsolved. Some agencies may refer to his disappearance as a non-family abduction. If you have any information concerning this case, please contact Naval Criminal Investigative Service 202-433-9183.
Number 5.
Tammy was last seen in Exeter, New Hampshire on November 13, 1984. She left her residence that morning to walk to school. The walk was 15 minutes and a neighbor reported seeing Tammy crossing Court Street at approximately 8 a.m. Tammy never arrived to school and was never seen or heard from again afterwards. Tammy wasn't discovered to be missing until after the school day ended. Her school did not verify children's absences until after her disappearance. Investigators and various people searched for her. It said that over 200 people were involved in the search for Tammy. They searched woods and fields as well as ponds. No trace of her was ever found. Investigators believe Tammy was abducted by a non-family member. There were reports of a blue vehicle being seen in the area when Tammy disappeared. For many years, her family held on to hope that she was still alive, and investigators also held out this hope. There were possible sightings of Tammy throughout the United States after her presumed abduction. Some of these sightings went as far as California. Investigators now believe Tammy was murdered on the same day she went missing. A man, Victor George Wanyati Jr., has been a suspect in Tammy's disappearance since December of 1984. He was questioned about her disappearance in the days after she was reported missing, and his car was searched. Victor has a criminal record that dates back to the 1960s for offenses like forced entry and larceny. He also has a record for sexual assault, and was paroled in June of 1983 for aggravated felony sexual assault against a female minor in May of 1979. He had only served 4 years of a 7 to 15-year sentence. He revoked his parole in December of 1984 because of arrest in Florida, and he was returned to New Hampshire State Prison in Concord, where he was to serve the rest of his term. Investigators attempted to file charges against him in relation to Tammy's case, but there wasn't enough evidence to do so. Victor was employed at Brad's Custom Auto Body on Main Street. This was just several blocks from where Tammy was last seen. Investigators also found a photograph of her inside of his residence as well. He also owned a blue vehicle like the one seen in the area at the time Tammy was presumably abducted. The car was described as a blue 1965 Ford, and it was registered to Victor in 1984. Victor is also considered a suspect in the 1984 disappearance of Marjorie Christina Luna. She disappeared from Green Acres, Florida on May 27, 1984, after going to a local convenience store and buying a bag of cat food. She never returned home. Victor was known to be in the area at the time Marjorie disappeared, and is considered one of the primary suspects in the case. He also lived near her residence at the time of her disappearance. Investigators have acknowledged that there's no physical evidence linking him to either girl's kidnapping. In 1992, Victor was sentenced to 75 years in prison for burglary and indecent exposure. During his trial, prison inmates testified that Victor confessed to killing both Marjorie and Tammy in 1984. He was never charged in relation to either case, however. He was released from prison in 2012 and died 8 months later. At the time of her disappearance, Tammy was a third-grade student at Lincoln Elementary School. Her father, Nelson, described her as timid and not the type of child to get into the vehicle of a stranger or even a neighbor. Tammy's disappearance remains unsolved. If you have any information concerning this case, please contact Exeter Police Department 603-772-1212.
Number 6.
Nicole was last seen in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania on March 11, 1982. Her mother, Melody Childs Thomas, reported that Nicole disappeared from a shopping cart in the Giant Eagle supermarket located at 23rd Street and Jane Street. Melody claimed that she left Nicole sitting in the bottom of the shopping cart as she looked at the meat counter. She said she turned around for a moment, and when she looked back, Nicole was gone. Authorities immediately started to search for the young toddler, but they found no trace of Nicole or her supposed abductors. Authorities were skeptical of the story from the beginning. No one reported seeing Nicole at the grocery store. However, according to a news article, a man at a pretzel stand reported that he saw a child matching Nicole's description staring at him while he made and sold pretzels outside the store. He stated the child was standing at the exit of the store, and she vanished soon afterwards. A school guard who was off duty on the weekend of Nicole's disappearance reported that she saw a woman walking with Nicole near the supermarket shortly after her disappearance. She was shown a picture of the missing child and confirmed it was Nicole. The woman that Nicole was seen with is described as thin, standing at 5'43", dark blonde haircut just below her ears. She was seen wearing a gray 3/4 length parka. She was around 50 years old in 1982. This woman was located soon afterwards and questioned. It was determined that she was not involved in Nicole's possible abduction. Authorities initially believed that Nicole was abducted in a custody dispute. Her father and mother both ended their 4-year marriage, and both wanted custody of Nicole. Nicole's father, Michael Bryner, was in Texas at the time of her disappearance, and flew to Pittsburgh to assist in finding his daughter. Her relatives, including her mother and her boyfriend, Timothy Widman, were all cleared of involvement in her case in the initial stages of her disappearance. Several days after Nicole vanished, her mother received a letter purportedly from Nicole's abductors. The letter said that Nikki was dead and buried. Handwriting analysis suggested that Nicole's mother, Melody Childs, wrote the letter herself. Extensive searching uncovered no signs of Nicole. There were many sightings of Nicole after her disappearance. One of these sightings took place in Bakersfield, California, when a man reported that he had seen a girl matching Nicole's description in the company of an unidentified male in a Bakersfield shopping center in 1985. By the time authorities reached the shopping center, Nicole and the man had disappeared. Authorities stated they are seeking a green 1979 Chrysler with Texas license plates. The man stated he recognized Nicole from the milk cartons that featured her photograph and information. It has not been confirmed that the girl was Nicole, but the man was extremely convinced that it was in fact her. In February of 1984, a man named David Romanelli was named as a possible suspect in Nicole's disappearance. David sexually assaulted and murdered 12-year-old Richard Grachowski in the same month. David was questioned regarding Bryner's disappearance, but there is no evidence to implicate him in her case. 4 years after her disappearance, Timothy Wayne Widman, Melody's live-in boyfriend at the time, confessed to killing Nicole in March of 1982. According to him, he was on a drug binge at the time and was sleeping when Nicole awoke him by biting his toe. He stated that he punched Nicole, and then she hit her head on a radiator. He didn't realize she was badly injured. Melody took Nicole to bed with her. The next morning they found that Nicole had died. They wrapped Nicole's body in a plastic bag and buried in a wooded area along Brookline, Pennsylvania. Investigators searched the area that Widman indicated, but Nicole's body was not found. He stated that it was Melody's idea to report the abduction to cover up her death. Widman was originally charged with involuntary manslaughter and was due for trial. Melody was arrested in June of 1986 for federal charges of lying to authorities about Nicole's disappearance. They had to bury the case because they could not find Nicole's body, and it was a law back then that a body must be found in order to prove murder or manslaughter. The law changed in 1988. In September of 2006, Widman was charged with criminal homicide in Nicole's case. Since the law changed, they can charge him with Nicole's presumed death. He cooperated with authorities, and in May of 2007, he admitted to Nicole's murder again. He pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter and was sentenced to 2 to 4 years in prison. He died at age 56 in 2011. He apologized to Nicole's living relatives. Nicole's mother died in 2001 at a Texas hospital after back surgery. Nicole's case remains unsolved and authorities believe she was the victim of foul play. Her case remains classified as a non-family abduction. If you have any information concerning this case, please contact Pittsburgh Police Department 412-255-2888.